I'm George Gallo, and I present كلمة on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. كلمة means free word. That's what I speak. So كلمة is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but talking about Beirut. The devastating explosion in the port of the city cost the lives of hundreds of people, maimed and disfigured thousands of people, and caused tens of billions of dollars worth of damage. Within hours, it seemed, little Napoleon Macron was strutting the streets of Lebanon, and other political leaders who had stood by during many serious trials for Lebanon over years, or actually participated in crimes against Lebanon, were suddenly crying crocodile tears and offering aid, but aid with strings, aid with an agenda. The impact of this blast may or may not change anything or everything in Lebanese politics. It came on the back of not only the devastating pandemic, but the equally devastating economic crash, partly caused by sanctions imposed on Syria, which, of course, as mission creep always does, crept across the borders and began to gnaw away at the entrails of the Lebanese economy. So when the blast came, Lebanon was already in trouble, and not least because of the regular raids of its neighbor, the State of Israel, which constantly encroached upon the sovereign waters and airspace of the Lebanese state, and equally regularly dealt out its own levels of death and devastation with bombs and rockets. Israel offered aid to Lebanon, which was contemptuously refused by the President, General Aoun. The idea that someone who's been regularly killing you can be trusted to faithfully deliver aid to you is, of course, preposterous. But that didn't stop them lighting up buildings in Tel Aviv in the colors of Lebanon. The hypocrisy with a capital H in the international response to this blast in Lebanon has been of a high order. Of course, the agenda for many is to blame the resistance in Lebanon, to try to turn the people against the resistance in Lebanon, to tie economic relief and rescue for Lebanon with the distance that is able to be put between the resistance and the people, between the resistance and the government of Lebanon. Nobody is saying, least of all me, trust me on that the governance of Lebanon has been of a high order in recent decades. I would be the last person to claim that. And of course, corruption exists in the political class in Lebanon, just like it exists within the political class everywhere. And in fact, some of the most corrupt people on the earth are the people closest to the Western politicians talking about corruption in Lebanon. Anyway, I've got, as usual, an audience of millions in your case, but a distinguished panel of experts in the studio here in London. So let's hear from them first off. Tim Llewellyn is such an old friend of mine that we traveled together to Iraq almost 30 years ago, and Iraq then being strangled by sanctions. Some things never change. He's a former BBC man, a grandee, in fact, was working in Tehran in 1979 for the BBC before the Iranian Revolution, and is the author of Spirit of the Phoenix, Beirut, and the Story of Lebanon. Tim, you know everything that there is to know about Lebanon. What's your first take on what happened, and then I'll ask you what happens next.
Well, my first take is that the British media have been signally bereft in the way they've covered the story. Of course, it's a massive tragedy, and we've seen it treated, as indeed it is, as a kind of earthquake story. Aid must be rushed in, people must be restituted. There's much talk, as you've said in your introduction, about the corruption of the body politic in Lebanon, and that's true. But what nobody wants to confront is the fact that if Lebanon is to be reconstructed after this, if there is to be real change, then the body politic in Lebanon is dominated, of course, by Hezbollah. And it's dominated by not just Hezbollah, but of course Hezbollah's relationship with Syria and Iran. Nobody wants to talk about that. It's a cliche, the elephant in the room, but that is something that will stand in the way of any international monetary rescue of Lebanon from the disaster it's been. I want to take you back, if I can, to 1990 at the end of the Lebanese Civil War. In 1990, there was an arrangement made which meant basically that Saudi Arabian money and Syrian force would ensure a new Lebanon, and there were reforms. 30 years on, that pact has broken apart. We see around Lebanon, in its closest neighbors, Syria and Saudi Arabia at odds with each other. Syria allied with Iran, at odds with Saudi Arabia. It would be fair to say that there is a kind of factional war going on in the Middle East now that Lebanon is the core of. But nobody wants to talk about this. Nobody wants to address it. It's too difficult. And I think that's what we should be talking about, this fundamental problem. Lebanon is a kind of cockpit of these regional antagonisms of which Israel is a central part, which I think make any hope of reform or change in Lebanon absolutely impossible at the moment.
You say nobody's talking about it. From where I sit, everybody's talking about it and talking about nothing else. They talk about it, but they don't give any context to it. We both know that Hezbollah only arose because of Israel's illegal occupation of Lebanon. But for Hezbollah, the Israelis would still be occupying Lebanon. The only reason Hezbollah have been fighting in Syria is because half the world invaded Syria with proxy armies and so on. So if the elephant in the room is Hezbollah, it was put there by the constant occupation and attack by Israel on Lebanon. And if Syria is part of that elephant, to continue your metaphor, well, who attacked Syria? Syria was no threat to anyone in the Arab world.
I'm just stating a fact, George. I think Hezbollah is a fact. And the reasons you've just given are eloquently put. And I agree with them. I'm not trying to, as a journalist, take sides. What I'm trying to say is this: Hezbollah is the most important political and military fact in Lebanon for reasons which we can go into. And I think they're valid reasons. It's there. It was created. What we can't do is not talk about it. And I think the West, when it talks now about monetary rescue, if you like, the IMF, the World Bank, funds going into Lebanon to try and change Lebanon back into the country it used to be, they have to take account of this. The political factor they have to deal with in Lebanon is Hezbollah. Whether they like it or not, whether it's a good thing or it's a bad thing, it doesn't matter. It's there.
Isa Ali is the RT correspondent in London and a political analyst, another colleague and friend of mine. Isa, would you lend your money to the government in Lebanon?
You can see that in Macron's words, as you described him, a little Napoleon complex, a man who can barely keep control of his own capital. He made a comment which not many people picked up on, that we're going to consult with political leaders and civil society. And this is this term, civil society, is always a bit of a red flag when it comes from Western leaders, because it generally means people who've been educated in the Lebanese context at the American University of Beirut, westernized Lebanese, people who work perhaps for the NGOs and have this outlook. And we've seen with the American official, David Hale, I don't know if everybody has seen this video, visiting Beirut, and these Lebanese with American accents telling him, welcome, please keep our politicians' feet to the fire, don't let them breathe, without realizing that that's the pretext for more sanctions and more suffering for the Lebanese people. And it would appear that that seems to be their aim, but as our colleagues so eloquently put, there are realities on the ground which are going to make that very difficult for the West to achieve if they have this kind of colonial, arrogant, leftover mentality of we're just going to swat in there and call the shots. In the context of the Lebanese government, of course, the people do have a lot of very legitimate concerns, but as we've seen, it's ironic that the politicians and the political blocs who are most guilty of the corruption are the ones who are the most aligned to the West anyway. And so it remains to be seen exactly what those protesters on the street want.
Isn't one of the dilemma for the West is that in this context, they cannot call for democracy, one man, one woman, one vote, because that would produce the result that they least want. It's one of the great ironies, and this is unspoken, that if Hezbollah wanted to completely control the state of Lebanon, they could do so easily, especially if there was democracy. But Hezbollah doesn't want to control the state because that would lead undoubtedly to civil war, all-out civil war, and the breakup of the country. Isn't that a handicap for those who are normally organizing democratic revolutions?
Absolutely. I mean, Lebanon has been the victim of this confessional system, which served its purpose to end the civil war, the Taif Accord, to ensure that, for example, the Speaker of the House has to be from a Shia, the President has to be a Sunni or a Christian, has to be the leader of the Parliament and so on, or the Prime Minister. And so, as you mentioned, if we were to do away with that system and have real democracy, you could see both positive in terms of you could see parties forming up away from the sectarian kind of confines and actually having cross-sectarian alliances. We've seen already Hezbollah having alliances with some of the Christian parties. And so, the story in Lebanon is very complicated, more than perhaps the outsiders might see it. And so that's something which the West don't want. And I think perhaps a way out for Lebanon would be to begin to look eastward. We talk about the IMF, we begin to talk about the French and the Americans and all this kind of the poison chalice they offer. Sayyid Nasrallah gave a speech a few months ago saying that according to their discussions and the discussions with the Lebanese government, the Chinese are willing to invest in Lebanon. I think there should be a alternative fundraising conference with countries like Russia and Qatar and other countries involved, and Turkey. I think there needs to be a shift in mentality inside Lebanon as well to get away from the old framework and perhaps to start looking eastward, because, as many people argue, perhaps the next century is a
Chinese century.
George, could I interject?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Macron was very careful where he walked about in Beirut. He didn't go to the Dahir. He didn't go to the southern suburbs, did he? And walk about there, where the 40% of the Lebanese population, the Shia, who support Hezbollah, and as has been so wisely pointed out, Hezbollah has become part of the democratic regime in Lebanon. He didn't go there, did he? he went and walked about in the areas where he knew he'd have the adulation of people who were obviously and deeply upset. And I understand there. I mean, it was an awful tragedy. But we get inclinations by that visit of the West's attitude towards Lebanon. They're not looking at it as anything but a rescue case, a sort of post-disaster in which they can possibly impose their own will on Lebanon afterwards, which is, of course, how Lebanon was created in the first
place. Yes. Dr. Niall McRae, lecturer at King's College and part of the pro-Brexit Bruges group. It's the only thing you and I have ever agreed on, I think, Doctor. But let me hear your take on what happened in Lebanon and what's likely to happen next.
Well, I think clearly, as has been pointed out already, the West and what I would call the sort of progressive globalists have been trying to exploit the situation. And what hasn't been mentioned yet is that this tragic explosion occurred at the time of the coronavirus crisis. And actually, Lebanon was one of the parts of the world where this COVID-19 crisis hadn't really struck too badly yet. I think at the time of the explosion, about 74 people had died of coronavirus in Lebanon, and there were about 700 or 800 cases, I think, that had been reported. So it was clearly not one of the countries that was most adversely affected, although, of course, it could get worse. Straight away, I felt that the globalists, like Macron, were jumping at this chance that here was a double whammy that allowed Western intervention, both the tragic explosion and the coronavirus crisis. And of course, it was said that when this dreadful tragedy occurred, the hospitals couldn't cope. The hospitals themselves were damaged in Beirut. And clearly this was an emergency that any country would have struggled to deal with. Even the most advanced Western country would have struggled to deal with an explosion, a catastrophe of this order. Actually, I think something like 3 times as many people died in the explosion as had died of coronavirus. But it's something which was there very much in the sidelines, this coronavirus thing, which was being sort of talked about as an added incentive for Western intervention. And Macron, of course, Lebanon being a former French colony, Macron thought that he was the man to go in and do this. You know, he's sort of, you've mentioned him being like a sort of neo-Napoleonic sort of figure. To me, he's very much in the character of Tony Blair.
Yeah, he's a short Tony Blair.
Yes. But he probably saw that adulation that he got in that very selected kind of walkabout in Beirut as something that would
That's a very interesting
him up
point.
and justify.
That's what happened with Blair, if you recall.
Yes.
In the Kosovan refugee camps, they were chanting his name and so on. This gave him this messianic mission to go around seeking to transform the world. It's a very interesting observation.
Yes, and I think clearly he's the type of person who thrives on hubris, and that would very easily have gone to his head, I think.
Extraordinary. Let's go to the United States. George Ajan from New Jersey is an international political strategist, election consultant, current affairs commentator who regularly travels between Beirut and the United States. George, welcome to كلمة.
Thank you, George. Always a pleasure.
What is your assessment of the current situation in Lebanon?
Well, the first thing I would like all of us to keep in mind, since none of us are actually on the ground, and of course I'm based in Beirut. I happened to leave the country for summer holidays with my family a few weeks before this all happened. So I've been obviously following it very closely, but I'm not there. And what's been made very clear to me by people on the ground is that what we are seeing on TV, as dramatic as it sounds, is only a fraction of the chaos and the shock that people in Beirut particularly are feeling right now.
So what's caused this desire for change amongst the masses in Lebanon?
Well, the consensus seems to be, and there's extreme rage on the ground over the negligence and the criminality of storing this material for all these years. And the unfortunate bit, and what people are really frustrated about, is that the likelihood of having a proper impartial investigation into that seems slim to none. On the positive side, there's extraordinary solidarity on the ground that really hasn't been seen before. And so could be a turning point for young people to really take the future into their own hands, which is all we could hope for, because frankly, the generations that have come before have given lip service to attacking corruption, but nobody has really managed to do anything about it. The same political class has been kept in place for decade after decade. And though people talk as if they're very frustrated, they sit on their balconies, they complain about it, but yet those people are elected time and time again. And so Lebanon cannot be compared to an autocratic system like Libya or Tunisia or Syria, where you have one family that essentially runs the country like a family farm. Lebanon has had elections, and as flawed as they may be, the same people continue to get elected, and that needs to change. And not Macron or any other international person can change that. That's up to the Lebanese themselves to change.
So what do you think it is that's caused this appetite for change?
We have to remember also there's something that's behind this explosion. What we have to keep in mind is that Lebanon was already reeling from an extraordinary, unprecedented monetary crisis. What that essentially means is that the middle class of the country is demolished, because people who were used to using their bank deposits in a Lebanese bank, even someone making a modest salary, was able to travel, was able to buy imported products. That has ended now. And so part of the rage is not only the rage that this explosion triggered, but it's the rage underneath that. People feel like their entire standard of living has been robbed from them by a corrupt banking system. So this explosion just adds fuel to that fire.
You refer to a monetary crisis. Many people believe that foreign powers are behind that crisis. What do you think of that?
George, I would reject that analysis. I think this is an internal problem. There was essentially a decision taken by the central bank and the government and the commercial banks to, a lot of people have called this a Ponzi scheme. Essentially, they offered extraordinary interest rates on fixed-term deposits, and there was something like $7.2 billion per year from Lebanese expatriates coming into the country. What that basically did is subsidize the standard of living for everyone else in the country. And, it's very unusual. The only other country where I've seen a situation where you can go to an ATM, put your card in, and pull out US dollars when you don't have a machine to print US dollars, that was Argentina prior to the crash in 2001. Yet in Lebanon, everyone acted as if Riyad Salameh, the central bank governor, had a machine printing US dollars, and he didn't. And finally, those chickens have come home to roost.
So you're sure about it? Foreign powers are not manipulating the situation in Lebanon?
No, that's a bridge too far. This problem is of the Lebanese own making. It wasn't because of any foreign pressure that the central bank and the banks and the government worked together to work out this elaborate scheme to subsidize electricity and play with the interest rates to benefit real estate investors. There's books that can be written about this, and it's not any kind of foreign conspiracy. That is purely a Lebanese problem that was ignored for too long.
Thanks, George.
With pleasure, George. Thank you.
There'll be more of that after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching كلمة with me, George غالاوي, on Mayadeen television, coming from London, but talking about Beirut. Talking of elephants in the room, Tim, George, just before the break, talked about the corruption in the political system, but also in the financial system. Did he have a point? I thought he over-egged it myself, but do you think he had a point? Who was responsible for an 800% or 900% devaluation in the value of the local currency?
Well, we do know that the system in Lebanon was corrupt, deeply corrupt. And it was a system which we should always remember was imposed on the Lebanese by the French when they left finally and reluctantly in 1946. A confessional system in which basically Lebanon itself was controlled by, if you like, a series of interlocking mafias. The system was every now and then dislodged at various periods, particularly during the Civil War after 1975, with the arrival of the Palestinians as an armed element in Lebanon. But basically, the system dragged on and on and on, which was that it was controlled by powerful families who paid one another off. The central bank in Lebanon was always extremely good about preserving the currency and about maintaining the currency. But the money on the ground, as it were, the way the money was manipulated, was all to the power of these different groups who switched it around amongst themselves. When Syria took over in 1990, the Syrians, unfortunately, or many of them, many of the powerful groups, became involved in that corruption, in smuggling, in currency dealing, in contracts, the sort of thing we're seeing actually in Britain now. But there it was writ large and ugly. And all that has drained away the fundament of the Lebanese economy, which relied very much on fiscal sobriety and propriety. It was taken away. And there is no way of dealing with that unless you reform the whole Lebanese system. And as I think we're hearing now, that has to be an international rescue job, which is impossible given the political constraints inside Lebanon. Who is going to agree? Which IMF, which World Bank, which Saudi Arabian money bags is going to agree to rescue Lebanon?
Yeah, well, Issa's point was that they may have to look elsewhere, and this may be a good time to look elsewhere. I mean, Lebanon has no, you know it better than me economically, it has no significant agricultural production. It has no working class, has no
It has brains.
manufacturing.
It has brains.
capacity. It has very great brains and perseverance, and they've made a miracle out of Lebanon several times. You talk about, your book was called The Spirit of the Phoenix. The phoenix rises from the ashes, and that's happened several times. The ingenuity of the Lebanese people is very famous, but they don't produce and they don't grow anything like enough to sustain their economy. So they need other people to holiday there, to buy property there, to rest their money there. And it's that which has caused the financial crisis, hasn't it? Because the friends of the United States have been told to stop going there, to stop buying there, to stop investing there, stop depositing there.
But it's also where it is. Lebanon sits between Syria and Israel. This is vital.
You couldn't get more front line, could you?
It's a frontline state. What we haven't said actually during this program is that there are at the moment about 1 million refugees inside Lebanon. Syrian refugees, not just the Palestinian refugees.
Several, but a Palestinian refugee population.
It's a recycle.
And a Syrian refugee population.
There's more refugees after refugees. This is what Israel has created in the area, refugee after refugee. You're a refugee Palestinian in Syria, then you're a Palestinian double refugee in Lebanon. And so it goes on. Lebanon not only is broke and run by, I think, a lot of very corrupt people with Western knowledge and cooperation, but it's also looking after more refugees than could come across the English Channel in 1,000 lifetimes.
Well, isn't that true, Issa, that the British media at the moment is in paroxysm about a few dinghies with a few hundred refugees? Lebanon has absorbed hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees and now at least 1 million Syrian refugees. Nobody's giving them much credit for that.
And especially when you look at the context of how big the Lebanese population is, I believe at the moment roughly half of the entire population is just the refugee population. And so it just shows how much of a burden that they've taken as a society and as an economy. And also the solidarity that they've shared as a state, obviously Hezbollah entering the Syrian battlefield as a movement, but also this the Lebanese state trying to do its bit to help these poor, desperate people who have been displaced. And to go back to perhaps the comments made by George, absolutely, everyone knows that there's been a massive problem with corruption in Lebanon. But again, as Tim's mentioned, and I think as we're all in agreement, this is a class which has been very close to the West and their allies. Saad Hariri, until Mohammed bin Salman decided to kidnap him a few years ago.
Everyone's forgotten that.
Still, yeah, just another part of the bizarro history of Lebanon. This is a man who I think is a Saudi citizen, is very close to Saudi Arabia, and all of this kind of comprador class. The West had no problem with these people taking their money out of Lebanon, parking it in Western banks and in London and in Switzerland and all these other places. And so it's a bit rich for them to now take a step back and go, oh, well, all of you guys are so corrupt and you just wouldn't listen to us. And I think, again, it goes back to the situation that you find Hezbollah in, because Hezbollah, even their biggest enemies, can't pin corruption on them. They know they're not a corrupt movement. They know they haven't had any hand in the running of the state or the corruption in the state. But that puts Hezbollah in a difficult position, because they understand that chaos is worse than anything else. So they're now in a position where it looks like they're defending the system without trying to defend the individual politicians or the individual blocks, because they realize, okay, fine, get rid of the Jajjas, the Jumblats, the Hariris, get rid of all of these corrupt people. But what comes next? You have to have a military, you have to have a police force, you have to have the functioning of the state underneath it. And so that's led to them being accused of being, oh, you're all the same, you're all in it together. But that's because they recognize the danger of the chaos, which it seems the West are trying to push through this whole narrative of total, complete change. And so, I think it's very easy for people to say things like, oh, it's a Lebanese problem and it's all an internal problem, and they just mishandled everything, which many of them did. But you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater because of...
Let's hear from Omar Ismail, who is in Sofia in Bulgaria. Omar, welcome to Kalima Horra.
Not a problem. Pleasure.
The catalyst for the current situation in Beirut was, of course, the horrific blast. But how do you assess the situation there?
I think if I can just say that Lebanon has always been a country that enjoyed some certain level of democracy, which was not available to most of the Arab countries. That was probably, it's been looked at by Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states, that they look at it as being a new battleground for influence to defeat the influence of Iran in Lebanon through Hezbollah, and in the same time finish once and for all any democratic hopes within this area completely. Because I think people will look at Lebanon as being a democratic country successfully run by a democratic government as an enigma for the whole area.
Regarding the economic situation in Lebanon, how fair do you think it is to suspect that the monetary crisis has the involvement of foreign powers?
The economic situation it started before the pandemic. So there is a lot of confusion at the moment in Lebanese politics. There is no doubt there's a huge amount of corruption within the government as well. There are 2 or 3 explanations. Is that the foreign influence, the interference by other states, and also the bad governance. They all add to what the misery that Lebanese is suffering from at the moment.
When a crime happens, we always ask, cui bono? Who benefits? Who benefits from further crises in Lebanon?
Well, it's a long list, and I think if you look at the West and European countries particularly, and the speed that Macron have sort of reacted to that tragedy, and he was there in less than 24 hours giving support to the Lebanese. Macron and France now, they look at themselves as being a prime mover in the Middle East politics and affairs. One has to look at what's happening in Libya and the influence that Macron and France is trying to exert in the war between the warring faction in Libya. So, and I think with the demise or possible demise of the British influence in the Middle East, France is probably trying to position itself as a prime mover within the area with a big, huge influence that can benefit it economically. So that's one country, but I think one cannot obviously discount the European interest, Turkey's interest as well. I think there is a sea economic zones between the two countries, and Turkey perhaps would look at this as an opportunity for itself to continue exploring for oil and gas in this area when the Lausanne Treaty comes to an end in 2023. One can also look at the main players in the Syrian affairs, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Iran. I think there are main players in the area. Egypt has an interest, obviously, because it doesn't see or it want to see a stable Lebanon. It does help in terms of the control over the Mediterranean by having a stable country or a stable government in Lebanon. You know, we haven't mentioned America and its interest in the Middle East as well. Russia too has an interest. Again, if you actually look at where the gas and oil, you will find those main players vying for control over the area. Russia, America, the European Union, and the rest of the Gulf states. So search for the oil, you find the reason for what's happening in Lebanon.
Omar Ismail, chair of the UK Egyptian Association. Dr. Nile, there he was again, little Macron. He's come up so many times today. And Omar helpfully reminding us of the extraordinarily vanguard role played by the former President Sarkozy in the Libyan disaster. And now we have Macron being right at the front of the confrontation with Syria and then arriving within hours in Lebanon. How credible an emperor is Macron?
Well, I think Macron probably thinks that France has got far more credibility than the US. I think that's the way he probably sees it.
That's probably true.
And it may well be true. But I think there's a danger that he is acting without much insight into how the mistakes that have been made before by the British and indeed other European countries in dealing with the problems of the Middle East. And I think that it's not surprising that France and other European countries will want to try and do something to help. I don't think that's surprising at all. I don't think it's necessarily anything wrong with that. But I think with Macron, it comes across as a bit hubristic, and you get the impression that he wants something more than just some sort of rescue, some sort of help that the Lebanese obviously need at this time. I think this is a real moment of a crossroads, isn't it, for Lebanon? Because, as has been mentioned, Lebanon could look elsewhere. It could decline the gifts offered by Emmanuel Macron. It could decide.
Beware of the French bearing gifts.
Yes, indeed. It could decide that America is too unstable and too unpredictable now to be a friend. It could look at Russia and Turkey as too problematic, and it could instead go head first into the Belt and Road Initiative from China. All of these options have got major cons as well as any pros. I think it's a very difficult. There's no easy answer to it. And I think that what I see as Western globalists, what they're trying to do is is as Tim has mentioned earlier, they're not really talking about Hezbollah at all. They're just seeing Lebanon as a country that's in trouble and therefore a country that could be rebuilt to the tune of globalist principles and practices and organizations, the IMF and the UN, World Health Organization, the sort of new world order, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, it would be really easy to rebuild Lebanon if it was in Central Europe. It's a small population, it's a small country. If everybody chipped in, you could transform the situation, but it isn't in Middle Europe. It's on the border with Israel and on the border with Syria. That is the problem.
Yes, and it's the same problem over and over again, where Western leaders don't appreciate just how complicated the politics and demographics are in the Middle East. And I think that Macron, you can just see the writing is on the wall. If he goes in any further, then he's going to come out badly, because I can't see him achieving anything more than what Tony Blair achieved in Iraq.
Tim.
Well, I would like to come in on the back of that.
Yes.
Because I think the Western leaders are all too well aware of what's at stake in Lebanon. What they present to the British public through the medium of the BBC and ITV and the mainstream media is a kind of simplistic solution that says, here's a tiny country, we must rescue it, they're people like us. And in a sense, they're quite right to do that on the level of, this was an earthquake, we must help. But the Western Macron and his team of French specialists who are well aware of what's going on all across the Middle East and the Levant and North Africa know damn well what Lebanon is all about. This was no chance mission. Of course, it had an opportunistic political flavor to it, but they know what they're doing. The French are taking a lead in their old colony. They know they can build on local hopes. And Macron probably thinks that in some way he can take on Hezbollah. But as I say, he didn't go to meet Hezbollah, did he?
He didn't.
That's. I mean, I know these are cliches. It's not the elephant in the room. It's the room. Hezbollah is the biggest political and military force in Lebanon.
Just before we close, Isa talked earlier about Said Hassan Nasrallah's second speech, which definitely did edge away from the original narrative that this was a simple industrial accident, closer to, but not at all the same, as Donald Trump's initial description of the events. What's your take? Accident or design, the explosion?
My lips are sealed.
Yours sealed too?
I initially immediately went towards an act of sabotage or an act of terror against Lebanon, because, just as I mentioned at the beginning, the history of how the US have been behaving in recent days and in recent months and years. Just a few points to very quickly pick up with regards to Macron, and you mentioned, Tim mentioned with regards to the collaboration with Greece. Macron is taking a very anti-Turkish stance at the moment. He's trying to force them out of NATO. He's trying to put pressure on them, which gives us opportunities, because the more he pushes Turkey out of the US camp, out of the NATO camp, will bring opportunities for Erdogan to look at things differently and perhaps get rid of this neo-Ottoman mentality he's displayed in the past, and perhaps think, actually, I should be collaborating and cooperating with the forces in the region, building my ties with Qatar, who in turn might be looking at the normalization the UAE have done and be tempted to go down that road. And if the Turks can play a positive role, that could pull them out of that very dangerous trap. And with regards to what the American plan is, in 2005, before the war in 2006, the Americans, the Israelis, and the French tried a similar regime change. They failed. Condoleezza Rice's famous new Middle East being stillborn, thanks to Hezbollah in large part. And I think this will fail again. But in order to do that, the Lebanese also have to look at themselves. Self-reliance, they have amazing, beautiful land in the Bekaa Valley. They should be utilizing that, growing their own food, and trying to become as self-reliant as they can rather than relying on imports in the outside world.
I entered the Arab world through the portal of Beirut more than 40 years ago. I put down roots that have never atrophied. Two of my children are half Lebanese. And so the explosion and the agony of Beirut matters more to me than it does to most British politicians. I, of course, like my guests, have my views, accident, design, who gains, cui bono. Isn't that always the question we ask, Tim? I know your lips are sealed, but cui bono, who benefits from the renewed turmoil in Lebanon? You don't have to look far, do you, to see who benefits most?
I told you, George, my lips are sealed.
I know, but I was trying to unseal them because the world waits for your bon mot.
Can I just draw your attention to a very good piece written by a former CIA analyst, which is available online publicly, called Philip Giraldi, who examines the whole case of cui bono and who might have done it, who might have... He doesn't come down conclusively, but Giraldi, who I think is one of the best commentators on the Middle East from the United States, does set out the stall, as it were. And if you read through that, then I think on that basis you can start to make your mind up about who might have been behind.
Nobody wants to say it was an act of war, do they? Because if it was an act of war, there'll have to be a substantial response.
Which the Sayyid hinted at in his speech, where he said, if we find this in Israel, there will be a response. I think the one thing as time has gone on that's pushing me more to this not being an accident is how quickly the narrative against Hezbollah built immediately after the blast. Very quickly there was big, well-designed banners going up saying, oh, Beirut shouldn't be the host to weapons. And this issue of Hezbollah's has long been
I must say one thing, which I think slightly goes against, counters what I think George is getting at, is that usually in Beirut, anything on this scale, any disaster, any bomb, any attack, any assassination, is usually immediately attributed to the Israelis by the Lebanese press, Lebanese spokesman, the word on the street. As you walk down Hamra, it'll be the Israelis are behind it. For some reason, the initial response to this bomb was not that way. There was not an immediate assumption that it was an Israeli job. And I thought that was quite interesting.
Indeed, we're asked to believe that only
however, just one thing I must just toss in, is that the Israelis immediately denied they were responsible before anybody had accused them.
Yeah, nothing is true until it's officially denied, as our colleague Claude Coburn famously said. But we're asked to believe, Niall, that it was pure stupidity, or rather mere stupidity, that 1,720 tons of ammonium nitrate had been stored in an unstable warehouse for 6 whole years. An accident waiting to happen. How plausible is that?
Well, I suppose it would still be there now, wouldn't it, if there hadn't have been that disaster, and how many more years might it have been kept there? I wouldn't want to speculate on whether this was purely an accident or whether there were devilish hands at work. But I think that what we see of the global reaction to, or the reaction of the West, it's this same old phenomenon, which is never let a good crisis go to waste.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, that's probably true. Last word from you, Isa. This material, why was it there? It was taken off a Moldovan registered vessel, Moldova being a very famous maritime power, and the ship was a Ukrainian one. Said that the cargo was destined for Mozambique, which sounds a little implausible to me, but it was worth millions of dollars and yet left in that warehouse. That's inherently suspicious, isn't it?
Well, I mean, look, there are different theories. There's an Iraqi, very pro-American figure called Mayadeen, who says that according to his understanding, this was material destined for the Syrian rebels when that conflict was going on. Whether or not that's true, the officials in charge of this port, again, belong to the same corrupt, pro-Western, pro-Saudi group or bloc within Lebanon. So again, the attempts to try to shift the narrative to, Hezbollah were storing weapons there. And so for that understanding of trying to shift it is whatever this material was, wherever it was there, they knew about it. These government officials knew about it. There should be accountability. But I fear, again, this whole thing of trying to get those who are responsible and ignoring that and just trying to cause chaos and anarchy and a power vacuum, essentially, in Lebanon, as we've discussed, seems to only be benefiting one side, and that's the side that's been historically very hostile to Lebanon and the region.
God bless Beirut. God bless Lebanon. Thank you very much for watching.